But we are going to do a character study of different people in the Bible. Now, most of the time when we go to the Bible, we talk about Abraham, Moses, Adam, Noah, things like that. But I want to spend time looking at some that we don't speak much about. We don't talk much about. Sometimes they're unnamed. They're not even mentioned or given a name for us. And to start out with, this is when I think about someone that we don't talk much about or doesn't have a name, I always think of this account. And that is the Shunammite woman. And this is going to be from 2 Kings chapter 4. Now we read about her in 2 Kings chapter 4 and also 2 Kings chapter 8. But we're going to spend time looking at this account in 2 Kings 4 this morning. And we'll mention chapter 8. And I would encourage you to go to chapter 8 and read about her there also. But in the history of what is going on here, we have Elijah in chapter 2 had been taken up in that whirlwind, that chariot. And Elisha is now left to take up the mantle and following Elijah. Now some would say that Elisha was one that had half the abilities as Elijah, but that's not the case. If you actually look at the miracles that are done by Elisha and Elisha raised someone from the dead, which we're going to see here in a little bit, and also raised someone from the dead after he had died. With the man that was cast into his tomb later on, and the man jumped up alive when he touched the bones of Elisha. But it's interesting looking at the history here. Elisha picked up the mantle of being the next prophet in the area of northern Israel. And so we're going to see he spent time between Mount Carmel and Samaria and going back and forth between those two. And so chapter 4 is a series of events that happened that really prove Elisha to be a prophet in two ways. One, in that he is able to perform several different miracles that we see in this chapter. We're only going to focus on one. But he also is able to predict if something happens in the future. This morning I was reading through the book of Deuteronomy, and Moses had warned the Israelites in the book of Deuteronomy that a prophet is known by if his predictions happen. And so here we see that happen in the book of 2 Kings chapter 4 with Elisha. But we're not here to focus on this man of God. We're here to focus upon the woman that is not named. She is only told to us to be the Shunammite woman. She lives in the area of Shunammite, and that's where she gets that name. But chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 8. We're going to read this account. Verse 8 says, "Now it happened one day that Elisha went to Shunem, where there was a notable woman, and she persuaded him to eat some food. So it was, as often as he passed by, he would turn in there to eat some food. And she said to her husband, 'Look now, I know that this man is a holy man of God, who passes by us regularly. Please, let us make a small upper room on the wall, and let us put a bed for him there, and a table, and a chair, and a lampstand. So it will be whenever he comes to us, he can turn in there.'" Now, notice her urging to Elisha here. She's not given a name, but we know that she lives in the city of Shunem. Now, this city was a part of the tribe of Issachar, and it was positioned about 5 miles south of Mount Tabor, if you're looking at a map of the ancient times. But it was situated between Mount Carmel and Samaria. And this is a route that Elisha would go on often. In chapter 2 and verse 25, it's mentioned that he would go between these two areas often. And so she saw him go in and out of this city very often. And she urged him to stop and to eat food. Now, it's mentioned of her that she is a notable woman. That word notable means great, to mean very great. It's often translated as great, as you use this word in other places in the Hebrew. But it also is a reference to her age. And that's going to be significant as we see later. but she is older in age. She is someone great. She was believed to be someone that was wealthy. She was married. And she persuades, so she's notable, and that's going to come up later. But she persuades Elisha to stop and eat food. She must have gained an understanding of who he was. It's stated here that she asked him to come in and eat some food. In verse 9, she tells her husband, "Look, now I know that this is a holy man of God." So in her conversations with him, when she fed him, she learned who he was and that he was a man of God. And she then persuades her husband to build a upper room along the wall for him to stay. Now, how often would that happen? We have someone that's a stranger that comes by, and we say, you know what, we're just going to build an extra room for this person, for him to stay in. That's her character. That's what we're going to see about her. She's a very hospitable woman, and she saw that need, and she wanted to help him. And so then verse 11, it says, "And it happened one day that he came there, and he turned in the upper room and lay down there. Then he said to Gehazi, his servant, 'Call this Shunammite woman.' When he had called her, she stood before him and said to him, 'Say now to her, Look, you have been concerned for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Do you want me to speak on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?' She answered, 'I dwell among my own people.' So he said, 'What then is to be done for her?' And Gehazi answered, 'Actually, she has no son, and her husband is old.'" Notice Elisha's gratitude. You know, Elisha was grateful for all that she had done for them both. If you look at Elijah and Elisha, and really any of the prophets that lived under the Old Testament, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, what did they do to the prophets? They killed them. They persecuted them. I don't think the prophets were treated very well. They always brought news of things that people didn't want to hear. And I think this was out of the ordinary for a person to be this caring about a prophet. And I think Elisha recognized her character and recognized her care and was very grateful for that. Probably didn't have a place to stay. He probably stayed in caves many times. We see Elijah staying in caves often. And so to have a bed, to have a place to sleep that was comfortable, and really in places he was probably felt protected, to take his rest. He was very grateful for that. And so he offers her the chance to have anything that she would request be brought to the king. That's a pretty big deal. He had influence in the king's court, and he offers her an ear to the king. If she had a request, he would take it to the king and ask it for her. Not only that, he said the commander of the army. That could be a reference to maybe someone that she's related to could have a position in the army. She could ask for their position there that would lift them up in the society. Those two things he's thinking, I could do this for you. But what does she say? "I dwell among my own people." She is stating with that statement, she is perfectly satisfied in dwelling where she is. She doesn't need anything. What does that say about her? Well, she is happy with her life and the things that she has. She didn't want anything in return. She was just showing love to him, and agape love, which we'll talk about later. So then verse 15. So he said, "Call her." When he had called her, she stood in the doorway. And he said, "About this time next year you shall embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant." But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her. And so Elisha promises her a son. She is going to have a child in her older age, and so also her husband's older age. And now her phrase, "do not lie," it's not meant to be something harsh. She's saying, don't deceive me. Don't say that you're going to give that to me and it not happen. Or something happens down the road to this child. which is going to happen. But she is joyous. She is joyous to hear of this happening, to have a child, and she does. And so that proves Elisha to be a prophet, because he said she would have a son about this time next year, and she did. So then verse 18 says, And the child grew, and now it happened one day that he went out to his father's to the reapers. And he said to his father, My head, my head. So he said to his servant, Carry him to his mother. And when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon, and then died. Now, the son dies. Now, the child was old enough at this point to be able to go out into the field with his father. And he says, My head, my head. Now, we are not told what it was. It could have been a brain aneurysm. It could have been a stroke. It could have been something. But whatever it was, he died. This is the child that she was promised to have by Elisha. But this child dies. They don't know why. The child dies in her lap. But notice some details here. Does she weep for this child? Is she concerned? She's very concerned. Notice verse 22. It says, verse 21, sorry. It says, And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, shut the door upon him, and went out. And she called to her husband and said, Please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and come back. So he said, Why are you going to him? It is neither the new moon nor the Sabbath. And she said, It is well. Now, if you're reading the ESV, I think it says all is well. That's a better phrase here. She, instead of weeping, takes that child, takes it up to Elisha's bed, lays him down on that bed, goes to her husband and says, I want to go to the man of God. Give me someone that can take me to him. And when he asks why, he doesn't tell her. She doesn't tell him. She says, all is well. Why would that be? She knew what Elisha could do. And she knew that Elisha could raise him from the dead. And she wanted to make sure she went to him to fix this. And so notice then the next verse. In verse 24. She says, Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, Drive and go forward. Do not slacken the pace for me, unless I tell you. And so she departed and went to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So it was, when the man of God saw her afar off, that he said to his servant Gehazi, Look, the Shunammite woman. He's excited to see her. That tells you a little bit about him, his idea of her. She was a very nice woman. She was someone that had treated him very well. He was excited to see her. He says, Look, the Shunammite woman. So verse 26, Please run now to meet her and say to her, Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child? And she answered, It is well. Again, she says all is well. Now, to her husband, she doesn't tell him that he's died. To the servant, she doesn't tell him that he has died. She says all is well. Very interesting. Then look at verse 27. Now when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet. But Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, Let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hid it from me and has not told me. Now what she did here must have not been very proper or something you didn't do to a prophet. She goes up and grabs his foot and holds on to it. Now Gehazi comes over and he starts to shove her away. And he says, No, stop. I can tell there's something wrong. God has hid it from me what it is. And now, notice what she does. Verse 28, So she said, Did I ask for a son of my Lord? Did I not say, Do not deceive me? Then he said to Gehazi, Get yourself ready, and take my staff in your hand, and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child. Now she says, Why did you deceive me? Did you not deceive me? That's a reference back to her statement when he told her that she would have a child. She said there, Do not lie. Do not deceive me. She said, Didn't you say you weren't going to deceive me? Now this child is dead. So what does Elisha do? He tells his servant to take his staff Take it to the child and lay it on the face of the child. So then verse 30. And the mother of the child said, As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you. So he arose and followed her. She refused to leave his side. Why is that? I think it's because she was determined that she was going to take him back to her home to raise her child from the dead. She wanted him to know that her child was dead. She was determined to take him back. So then verse 31, Now Gehazi went on ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet him and told him, saying, The child has not awakened. So verse 32, When Elisha came in the house, there was a child laying dead on the bed. And he went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Now, it's kind of a weird situation here when we read this. Elisha goes into where the child was at. He lays himself on top of him, his mouth to his mouth, his eyes to his eyes, his hands to his hands. The purpose of that was to warm the child. And so he starts to warm the child. He gets up, he paces back and forth in the house. He goes back up and does it again. And then the child sneezes 7 times. Now, 7 is significant. We're going to see the next chapter. I think it's the next chapter, Naaman. Yeah, in chapter 5, Naaman had to dip in the Jordan 7 times. 7 is significant, and I think that probably has something to do with this also. But the child then sneezes 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. And so then verse 36, And he called Gehazi and said, Call the Shunammite woman. So he called her, and when she came into him, he said, Pick up your son. So she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground, and she picked up her son and went out. And that's the end of the account of the Shunammite woman. But it's interesting to see the things that had happened here. She trusted in Elisha, and that he was able to raise her child from the dead. She had a lot of great characteristics, and those are the things that I want to look at as we talk about the lessons that we can learn from the Shunammite woman. The first one is, point 2, she was one who strived to be pleasing to God. She was one that strived to be pleasing to God. Now, we talked about how there was many people who did not care about God. Remember, she's in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom did not have one king that was good at all. And she lives in this area north of Samaria, in that northern kingdom, yet she still was pleasing to God. She was one of those that Elijah was told still feared God several chapters back. And so she knew that Elisha was a man of God, and she wanted to make sure she took care of him. In doing this, by taking care of Elisha, she was also doing good to God, right? That's kind of what Jesus says. And notice in Matthew chapter 25. In Matthew chapter 25, notice what Jesus says in verse 34. I'm not going to read all of this. But Matthew 25 and verse 34 says, Then the king will say to those on his right hand, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? And the king will answer and say to them, Surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to the one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. She was doing good for God by helping Elisha. And that's the same thing that you and I can do today in helping those that are strangers, those in a sense, he was a stranger to her at the beginning. And she wanted to feed him because she saw him back and forth often. She put God first, and God built up her house. She strived to be pleasing to God, and God blessed her for that. How did he bless her? Well, she got a son. She was barren. She didn't have a child. And because of her focus upon God, God blessed her home. I think God blessed her home in many other ways, but we see that just in that one example here of God blessing her with this child. Think about today. When we focus upon God and put God first in our life, does God bless our homes? He does. You think about Proverbs chapter 24. Proverbs chapter 24. Notice verse 3 and 4. Proverbs 24, 3 through 4. Through wisdom a house is built, and by understanding it is established. By knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Here we notice wisdom and knowledge builds a God-centered home, one that is blessed. Joshua chapter 24 and verse 15, what did Joshua say? As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Was Joshua's house blessed? Was Joshua blessed? Yes, he was. And so she was one that strived to be pleasing to God. Notice the second thing, which we've mentioned already. She was hospitable. She was hospitable. She first urged him to eat at her house. Then she urged her husband to make a place in their home for him. When you talk about hospitality, that is pretty hospitable. To go even to the point of making and adding a room to your house, to house a stranger, to give him a place to sleep. And notice, did her husband question her? No, he didn't. We're going to talk more about that later. But he knew this was important. She knew it was important. She put herself out there to take care of this man. She was well off. It's believed that they were wealthy because of their home and being able to do the things that they did. But she made sure she did good with what she had. And Paul talks about that in 1 Timothy chapter 6. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, notice verse 17 through 19. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 17 through 19. Paul says, "Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share, storing up for themselves a good foundation for the time to come, that they may lay hold on eternal life." That's what she did. She took her wealth, in a sense, and used it to do good. And you and I can do the same today for those that are in need. So being hospitable is really a focus upon Christianity. In 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10, the widows indeed were to be ones that were hospitable. To be a part of that classification of widows indeed, they have to be hospitable. They had to show that through their life. In Titus chapter 1 and verse 8, for an elder to be qualified as an elder, or a man to be qualified as an elder, he had to be hospitable. Those are all characteristics that you and I as Christians should have. We're desiring to be, for us men that are striving to be an elder someday, we need to learn to be hospitable. And so being hospitable is important. 1 Peter chapter 4. 1 Peter chapter 4, notice verse 8 and 9. 1 Peter 4, verse 8 and 9. It says, "And above all things, have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another without grumbling." We are to learn to be hospitable because we love those that we are housing or those that we're helping, and not grumbling for that. And so being hospitable. The third thing, she was one that had true agape love. That's one thing that stuck out to me. especially in her discourse, when Elisha said, "What can I do for you? What can I give you? I could go before the king for you. I could go to the commander of the army for you. I could give you really anything you ever want because of what you've done for us." She says no. She didn't do those things to receive something. She did those things because she had a true agape love for others. When you think about agape love, it is love that does not expect anything in return. She didn't expect anything in return. She saw a need and she wanted to help him. When she learned he was a man of God, she wanted to help him even more by giving him a place in her home. And so she had true love. And 1 Corinthians chapter 13, it tells us about this type of love. And I think this describes her perfectly. 1 Corinthians 13, look at verse 4 through 8. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, does not provoke, thinks no evil, does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never fails. And so we'll stop there. Love is what she had. And that's a love that we should have for others. We're not expecting anything in return for the things that we do. We are just doing it because we are showing the love that Christ had for us. And so she had a true agape love. The next thing, notice about her, is she was one that was content. And also in that discourse of her saying she didn't need anything, in that statement that she made there, she was content. She was happy living in the life that she had. She was happy with the life of living with the people that she was around. And her home, she didn't want anything different. She didn't need anything different, even though it was offered to her. She was content. She was happy living among those she was around in her home with what she had. And that reminds me of Paul. And Paul talking about being content. I think this can be hard for most people. And learning to be content with what we have. And Paul was a great example of that. Philippians chapter 4, and verse 11 through 13. Philippians chapter 4, 11 through 13, Paul says this, "Not that I speak in regard to need, for I have learned in whatever state I am to be content. I know how to be abased. I know how to abound. Everywhere in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Paul, in the times that things were good and the times that things were bad, Paul learned to be content. I think that's a great example that the Shunammite woman gives to us, is learning to be content with what we have and where we're at in life. Next thing that we notice about her is that she was one her husband trusted in. I think that's important to notice because several times she wanted to do something, he never questioned her because he trusted her. When he wanted to have when she brought a stranger into their home to feed him, when she brought a stranger, which really didn't turn into a stranger at that point, but the man of God into her home, when she asked him to build onto their house, he didn't say no, he did it. When she wanted to go see the man of God, he didn't tell her no, he trusted her. And so we can see that trust that they had for one another and that trust that he had in his wife. And that reminds me of Proverbs chapter 31. Proverbs chapter 31. And look at verse 11. When we look at this woman that's mentioned in Proverbs 31, notice verse 11. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. He knew she would not waste any of the things that they had. She managed their goods, etc., wisely. She was wise in using them to care for the man of God. He trusted her with those things. He trusted her when she asked him for these things. And she was stated to be a notable woman. She brought honor to her home because of her excellence. And you look at Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 1, That word notable is used there in reference to a home and her excellence. And her focus was upon God, and because of that, and her character, her husband trusted in her. The next thing we notice, now we're running low on time, she had a great faith that believed Elisha could raise her son from the dead. She took that child and laid it on his bed. She didn't weep. She didn't do anything different. She immediately took the child to his bed. She didn't tell her husband. She didn't tell the servant, Elisha's servant. She went directly to him because she knew what he could do. He's the one that predicted that she would have a child. And now she knows that he could raise him from the dead. So do we trust in God? Do we have that kind of faith when life is tough? She trusted in God. She trusted in him. And then the next thing, she did not question Elisha's commands. And this is where I encourage you to go and read later. But 2 Kings chapter 8, verse 1 through 6 is the second account we find of the Shunammite woman. There was a famine coming upon the land. And Elisha came specifically to her and said, take your family and go to Palestine, in the area where the famine would not be. And she did. She didn't question it. She went and spent 7 years in another land during that famine. And when that famine was over, she comes back to her home and her land gone. Somebody else owned it. And through God's providence, she got her home and her land back. God took care of her. And so she did not question when she was told by Elisha to go. But then the last thing I want to notice, real quickly, is that though she was not able to do the miracles or teach as Elisha did, she did her part to support him. You know, there are many examples in the New Testament of women who supported the work of the church. If you go to Philippians 4 verse 3, we're told about Euodia and Syntyche. We also learn about Lydia in Acts chapter 16. Romans chapter 16, Paul mentions many women that helped him. God gave men and women different roles, but it doesn't mean that one is over the other. There is importance for each role. And we see many examples of women doing great tasks to support the work of God. And she was one of those. She did what she could. She wasn't able to perform the miracles that Elisha did or to teach in the way that he was able to do, but she was able to do everything she could to support him. You know, there's many people that are not able to go on mission trips, but yet we support people to go. Like Terry and Andy are going to be going on a mission trip. We support them to go. And so that is important for us to do, and something we can learn from this, to do our part to help support the work of God. And she did that. Now, when we think about the Shunammite woman, she's never named. We just say the Shunammite woman. But we are left with a great impact upon ourselves by when we read about her. She was a woman of great faith, love, trust, and hospitality. She was a great woman who supported a man of God in his mission. She is someone that we can imitate in our Christian walk. There's a lot to learn from her, even though she's never named. And so I encourage us to take these lessons that we've learned from her and apply them to our life, because there are a lot of things that we can do to better our lives as Christians in following that example. And so today, I encourage you to put on Christ in baptism. If you have not done that, it's the first step in being pleasing to God. It's that first step in being a servant of Him, is putting on Christ in baptism. If you haven't done that, I encourage you to not wait, to not put it off, but to do it now as we stand and as we sing.